Once again, let me welcome you to Anchor Church. We're just so glad that you're here. Really, there's just so many of your new faces. So if you're looking around, going, "Well, I feel like a first-time guest and a little uncomfortable," actually, probably 25% of you are that way. So it's just that's how it is every week. And so I want you to know you're new. It's okay. We love you. Some of you and others of us have been a part of Anchor Church for 4.5 years. So we're a church plant, which means thank you, Greg. I needed that. We're a church plant. Hey, where's my high five, Ian? Okay, thanks. Yeah. So, all right, this was unplanned. I love it. So we're a church plant, which means we're a church that got started about 4.5 years ago. But the truth is, really, it's probably more like 7 years ago when my wife and I, Joanne and I, opened up our home to begin making disciples out of our home, building relationships with neighbors, co-workers, people that we work out with, or people that we just hang out with. So that's kind of the beginnings of a church, is just the notion of just hanging out with people and making friends. And sort of it led to a few years from there, us actually starting to host Sunday worship gatherings together. And so that was about 4.5 years ago. And so we're glad that you're here. Some of you have been here for the long haul since we first started, or even before we started, and some of you are brand new, but we want you to feel like family. That's kind of a really big thing for us. We really want you to feel like family here. We want you to feel comfortable here. And so the last few weeks, typically January is the month where we might just go into the year, try to shape some of our expectations in terms of what it looks like to be a part of Anchor Church. So the very first week, actually New Year's Day, we had a big brunch and we hung out, and that was a really good time. And then the following week, we picked up the theme of gospel. The next week, we looked at community. And then this week is the third in this sort of 3-part series where we look at what it looks like to partner with one another. What does it mean to join a church? And even more specifically, what might it look like for us if you're going to become a part of Anchor Church? And so we're glad that you're here. You're catching us at a part where it might be good, actually, to sort of gauge your expectations and maybe even understand a little bit about what makes us tick, what makes us excited. So in terms of mission this week, we have a phrase that we use that's on your bulletin. If you received a bulletin, at the very front, at the very bottom of the front, we have 3 sort of, I don't know if you'd call them catchphrases, but they're part of our vision, part of sort of what we hope will happen in the lives of all the people who are part of Anchor Church. And the first one is anchored in the good news of Jesus. And we kind of covered that the first week, just a couple of weeks ago. The next one is anchored in community with one another as God's family. And that's kind of what we talked about a little bit last week. So you can listen to those messages online, either at our website or on our app. And then the third one is where we're at today, anchored in Hampton Roads for God's global mission. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. As we think about the expectations that Jesus has for the church, sort of his life and his death, his burial, his resurrection, and then his ascension as he leaves, we think of a couple of things. He's tasked us with the incredible responsibility to love God and to love our neighbor. When he's asked what's the greatest commandment of all, he summarizes it with that statement, and we call that the great commandment, which is to love the Lord your God and then to love others as yourself, or to love others, love your neighbor. So when he gives us that command, that sort of encapsulates everything that he would expect a follower of Jesus Christ to do. So anything related to what God might want us to do, or how God might want us to behave, or how we ought to be thinking, or any of our perspective in life, all of that is shaped by those 2 things. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your might, with all of your strength. That's the first. And then the second is just like it. Love everyone you meet with God's kind of love. That's it. That encompasses everything that is our responsibility. Now, as Paul or Peter or some of the other people who write the New Testament, they give us specifics in terms of what that looks like. What does it look like for a husband to love a wife? What does it look like for a wife to love a husband? What does it look like for children to live in the home in obedience to their parents? There's all those specifics, but I think if you were to ask Jesus, okay, so we've got all those things. We've got so much here about how we ought to live and what life looks like for a Christian. How would you summarize all this? I think he'd just say what he told his disciples. Well, I would summarize it by saying, look, in everything you do, love the Lord your God with everything in you, all of your might, all of your strength, with all of your mind, with all of your heart. That answers everything. And then the next, you show love to everyone you meet. That's the question that they ask him, actually, because what Jesus says is to love your neighbor. And then they say, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus begins to explain through some parables and stories that actually your neighbor is anyone you come in contact with. So how should we feel about all the things that are happening in our nation? How should we feel about what's happening in our neighborhood? How should we feel about what's happening in the close friendships we have or in the relationships we have in our family, our immediate family and extended family? What should be our disposition toward them? Well, first, we love the Lord our God with everything in our might, our strength, our mind, our hearts. And then secondly, whatever we do, whatever our disposition, it has to look like God's love. Love your neighbor. So, when we get to the Great Commission, we build on that where Jesus says, I want you to go into all the world and I want you to make disciples. And that should be up here on the screen here. It's in Matthew 28, verse 18 to 20. And here in Matthew 28, what Jesus is telling us is that he has all authority, he has all power, and he's commissioning his disciples to go into all nations and preach the good news of Jesus Christ to everyone. Now, how would you summarize the message that they're supposed to go and preach to all nations? I just gave you some clues. Well, you do it with those two things. The message they're going and proclaiming to all the nations is that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and that we are to love our neighbor. And it's accomplished through the good news of Jesus Christ, which is that he has done everything possible for us to win us to Christ, to save us from our sin, to save us from death, and to bring us into relationship with God so that we can worship God, so that we can love him, and so that we know better how to love others. So I'm trying to tie this together. We've got the Great Commission, and then we've got the Great Commandment, and then we've got the Great Commission where Jesus says, go now and teach everybody all the things that I've taught you. And then when we see the Great Commission, Jesus is saying to go and make disciples. And just before that, he has promised that he will be building his church. It's something that he says to Peter. He says that on this rock, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Now, when you get to the Great Commission where Jesus is sort of giving them his final charge, you would expect him to say, now I'm building the church. Now you go out there and do everything you can to go start a bunch of churches. And he doesn't say that. He says, I want you to do everything you can to go and make disciples. And what I want you to see, what we've preached 100 times at Anchor Church over the last several years, is that making disciples is starting churches. Or another way to put it is that if any of you ever thought you might want to start a church, and why you would, I have no idea. If any of you ever thought you might want to start a church, first I'd say just make sure your calling is clear. But secondly, I'd say, hey, if you're going to start a church, the way to go about that is what Christ explains to us in the Great Commission. So in other words, it's making disciples. They're one and the same. I see them congruent. In other words, starting a church really isn't looking for the most ideal spot, seeing if you can't come up with enough money for the lease, and then getting some nice signage, and then just doing everything you can to get everybody out there to hear about you so that you can just fill up this weekly event with more and more people. Not a bad thing, and none of those things I've said are evil. What I'm saying is that, though, at its core, starting a church, being a part of a church, looks more like just making disciples day to day, day in, day out. Disciple making. And so what I'm calling you to, in terms of our mission at Anchor Church, anchored here in Hampton Roads for God's global mission, is that we would begin here making disciples and that we would pray and even be sent throughout the world to make disciples. And really, anytime we're engaged in the process of making disciples, we're engaged in the process of starting churches, even if it's at its seed form. In other words, what I want you to see really is just not so much that being a part of a church just means that you have to, attend a church gathering, that you have to attend a community group, that you should be involved in community service with your church, and that you should do all of these things as sort of your obligation because you're part of a church. I'm trying to help you see that when you engage in building relationships and sharing the good news of Jesus with others and demonstrating what the love of Christ looks like in those relationships, I'm calling that discipleship. And when you engage in that, you and I are actively fulfilling the Great Commission that Jesus gave us. And in a very real sense, we're a part of the building of the church that Jesus said he would do. Guys, I'm calling us to something higher than just church attendance or offerings in the offering plate or just small group attendance or just whatever you might typically think of as in terms of what church looks like or what it means to be a part of a church. I want to call us as Anchor Church to see that as sort of, yeah, sure, that's part of it, but there's way more to it than that. And I want to call us, our motives and even our aspirations to something higher than that. And what I'm calling us to is to make disciples out of all of the friends and neighbors we meet. To share the love of Christ with them, to share the good news about what Christ has accomplished for us, but also to show them what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus Christ, what it looks like for your heart to be overwhelmed with God's love, and what it looks like to be on a trajectory of growth or transformation, life change. The truth is, so many of us want that. I mean, maybe I just speak for myself, but there are areas of my life that I want to change. Some of those areas have been since I was, a teenager, and others of those areas are just sort of recent things that I'm like, why am I thinking that way? Why do I get so upset about little things like that? There's always little things that I'm always thinking to myself, I wish would change. And the truth is that only the good news about what Jesus Christ has done for us can truly set us free. And what I'm hoping you hear is that when you share that good news with other people, you're engaged in the work that Jesus has commissioned us to do. That's a high calling. That's meaningful. That's valuable. There's tons of purpose there. And so when we think about becoming a part of Anchor Church, I want you to think about being a part of a global movement. Although when you're at Starbucks, it may not feel like a global movement. When you're in class and it's after class and you're talking with someone who seems to really be struggling, and so you're trying to sort of talk them through whatever they're going through and just be present maybe, just listen with them. It doesn't feel like you're part of this global movement. It doesn't feel like you're, at a mega conference where maybe just people are just overwhelmed with the presence of God. And it might not feel like you're a part of something huge, but what I'm trying to do is convey to you that those little moments, those opportunities in the context of our ordinary lives, when you join God in the process of making disciples, you are joining with the rest of us in a global movement of church planting, of making disciples, of seeing Jesus Christ worshiped among all nations. I hope that inspires you. At least write it down and maybe later this week, see if you can't draw some inspiration from that. I'm hoping that for us, this becomes what we believe to be part of our partnership together or membership at Anchor Church. In other words, I want you to count on me to be doing that. I want to count on you to be doing that. The way, and I might even just say practically, the way that my wife and I went about starting this church with the help of so many of you, the way that we went about starting this church really isn't something, although we did make sacrifices and although, we did have to free up our time in some other places, as I look at the core of what we were doing, it's not something that really any of you couldn't do. We opened up our garage and we played out in the front yard instead of the backyard. That's all we did. And we met our neighbors. Then we hosted several events throughout the year, and we invited our neighbors over for a potluck dinner, and we got to know them. We found out that some of them were Christians, so we began to pray for the other neighbors. And then some of our other neighbors found out that we were not only praying for them, but also sort of meeting on a monthly basis for dinner and even some Bible study, and more of them began to join us. And all we did was simply open the garage door and open the front door. That's all we did. You could start a church. Again, make sure you're called. Come talk to me. But what I'm saying is, when you do that, you're on the front lines of the great commission of Jesus Christ to the church. You are literally on the front lines of what God is doing around the world when you open up your garage and you step outside and you begin to interact with your neighbors. Or when you step outside of the classroom or you step outside of the office and you get to know your coworkers or your classmates or your neighbors or whomever it is that you're interacting with. When you interact with them, when you engage in a relationship with them, and when you begin to share the good news of Jesus Christ with them, you and I are on the front lines of what God's doing in the world. So be encouraged by that. Don't see your ordinary life as just hum-ho, just what you got to do to get through the day. See every single day as an opportunity at every moment to be able to be on the front lines of what God's doing in the people around you. And I'm encouraged by that, and I hope you are too. I want you to see yourself as part of a church, a global church planting movement. You, not me or just the church planters around the world, but you and me. The other thing that I want to share, I guess, is I want you to think about this for a second, just real practically. And this is where you and I fit in, not just what I just described, but I think to take it even further, or maybe just to hone it down a little bit. Can you name someone whose life might be changed if they would come to Christ, if they would just believe in Christ and begin to walk in relationship with him, allow him to sort of change their perspective and to begin to slowly change every area of their lives? Can you name someone like that? I think most of us probably could, whether they're Christian or maybe they're not yet a Christian, but maybe you could name someone that if they would just engage in their relationship with Christ, their lives would change. I just know it would. Not necessarily that everything would become easier, they'd have no hardship after that, but I just think their perspective would change, their life would change. Well, if you know someone like that, that could very well be the call of God to you personally for your part in the advance of God's kingdom in the world. Literally, you get to be a part of what God is doing around the world by simply focusing on the one or two or three that God has put right in front of you. If we're going to partner together as a church, it really goes beyond just like, hey, you got to show up on Sundays. Or it goes beyond, hey, you got to make sure you write a check every week and put that bad boy in the offering. It's got to go further than that. It's got to be real. It's got to be community. It's got to feel like family. There has to actually be life change. There has to be actually good news that we're sharing with other people. And not only that, but I think there has to be purpose, a shared sense of purpose for why God has called us together at Anchor Church. And that shared sense of purpose is that each one of us are doing what he's calling us to do to advance the kingdom in the lives of our friends and family, our neighbors, coworkers, classmates. This is how we partner together at Anchor Church. So the last few weeks we've been talking about partnership, and I know that joining a church or becoming a member of a church might be either a foreign concept or just a really scary one because of how many of us have been burnt by churches in the past. And what I'm asking the last couple of weeks and even today is that you might see that when we're asking for you to join our church, it might be scary to think that we might be asking for your time, or that we might be asking for your money, or that we might be asking for your energy or resources. And I want to tell you that honestly, those are just low-lying fruit. The gospel or the good news about what Jesus Christ has done calls for way more than that. It calls for all of who you are. And that's what I'm calling us to as a church. To go all in, not just a couple of chips here, a couple of chips there. Sorry for the poker analogy during a sermon, but I want you to go all in. And last week, what we learned to tie it together is that the good news about what Jesus Christ has purchased for us is that it doesn't necessarily free us from commitment. Like, well, I'm free in Christ. I don't have to be a part of anyone's life or be in community with anyone. The good news of Jesus Christ actually frees us to fully commit with no fear of loss. Because the good news of Jesus Christ is that God has made up the difference and then some with a personal relationship with him. So we have nothing to fear. We have everything to gain by engaging in the good news of Jesus, letting it change our hearts, engaging in community with one another, and letting the gospel just form the sense of family that we all long for anyways. And then we let the good news of Jesus Christ move us as a church out into the community, out into the world. So I want to ask you, would you join us in making disciples? As I think about the process of making disciples and how, for me anyway, that's just equivalent to the notion of starting churches, my prayer is that at Anchor Church that we could literally see several healthy churches started in the next 10 to 20 years. And you know where that work's going to come from? You know who's going to do that work? You know how that's going to get started? Again, I've given you some hints. Yeah, you open your garage door. Thank you for that. That was rhetorical, but you got it. We open our garage door. We open up our front door. We open up our hearts to the ones around us. And do you know what it means to be vulnerable? I guess a word picture for that is to take off your armor and to hand someone else your sword. To become vulnerable with them really is to sort of expose yourself in such a way that they have the potential to hurt you. And I understand that. I understand that. That's happened to me. That's happened to you. And I guess what I'm saying is as we open up our hearts to the people around us, in our church and outside of our church, as we open up our hearts to them or our front doors to them or our garage door to them, what we're doing is actually making ourselves vulnerable for the sake of the good news of Jesus Christ. And I think that's going to require some commitment on our parts. But I really do wholeheartedly think that in the next 10 to 20 years, we could see several churches planted because of the work we do together to just make disciples. We could see several churches, dying churches or smaller churches, revitalized by the good news of Jesus Christ just because we make disciples together as a partnership in the gospel. So I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by thinking through that and what that might look like. I'm encouraged by strategizing to that end. But the truth is, no amount of money or strategy or I guess any other kind of resource would ever accomplish what just a group of people committed to the Lord Jesus Christ and his good news and committed to one another and committed to sharing that good news with other people. There's nothing compared to what that could accomplish in a city or what that could accomplish in a region. And that's what I'm calling us to. So I want you to partner with us. I want you to become a part of Anchor Church. I want you to see your part, not just in understanding the gospel and letting it change your life, but and not just even in becoming a part of the church family and getting to know each other and care for one another, but even your part or your partnership in sharing that gospel with everyone you meet. You might share it, you might show it, but either way, we're proclaiming and we're demonstrating what the gospel looks like. One of my favorite phrases is that we're demonstrating what it looks like to live under the reign of Jesus. What it looks like for us to live under the kingship or authority of Jesus. How does that look to your neighbors? How does that look to your friends? How does that look to the people that you interact with? So I'm encouraging us to see that we are expected to live under the reign of Christ here in Hampton Roads, anchored in Hampton Roads for God's global mission. And that is whatever he's doing here and whatever he's doing around the world. 2 Corinthians 5:14 is a verse that I want you to see in terms of, it's sort of a key verse for us in terms of what God's doing in our lives and what he's doing around the world. So I want you to turn to 2 Corinthians 5. I want you to read, we're going to read verses 14 down to 21. Here in 2 Corinthians, what we're learning about is basically the call of God to all of us to be reconciled to God, to be joined to God in such a way that we are motivated by the love that God has for us and motivated to go out and not only be reconciled to God, but to help be a process of reconciliation for other people. I'm going to read it quickly here, and I want you to follow along with me. In verse 14, he says, "The love of Christ controls us." It controls us, it motivates us. That word control is the same word as like motivate us or constrains us. In other words, we are so desperately motivated by the love of Christ that we do these things. That's what he's saying here. The love of Christ controls us because we've concluded this. This is the conclusion we've come to, that one has died for all, therefore all of us have died. We are all dead men walking. And he died for us so that those of us who live would no longer live for ourselves, but for him who for our sake died and was raised again. I want you to skip down to verse 18. He says, "All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation." He says, what I mean is that in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Stop right there. He's already talked about the ministry of reconciliation and the message of reconciliation. And that for me is the same thing as saying the gospel we share with people in proclamation and the gospel we show people in demonstration. We have the ministry and the message of reconciliation. And then the last thing he says here is, therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, making his appeal through us. And we implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God, because for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Real quickly, what I'm saying is that we are motivated to a gospel partnership with one another because of the love that Christ has, because he has reconciled us to God, brought us together into good relationship with God. And by virtue of being joined to God, we now join God in his mission or his purpose to see that everyone we come in contact with be reconciled to God as well. That's our partnership. That's what it looks like. And guys, that's kind of what I'm hoping is a representation of Anchor Church, our vision, our mission, our purpose. So I'm encouraged by that, and I want you to be encouraged by that too. There's a couple of practical things that I had for us, and I kind of already shared them, right? Opening up your heart, opening up your home, opening up your front door, your garage door. There's a couple of other thoughts that I had for us as we share the gospel as we go out. The first is that as we go out into the community, as we sort of exist in our neighborhood, workplace, classroom environment, educational environment, wherever we are, wherever God's calling us to do, there are two things that our presence does for them when we leverage it for the good news of Jesus and the Great Commission, or sort of making disciples. One is we make grace tangible. We make God's grace tangible, meaning they can see it, they can touch it, they can feel it, they can smell it. One of the things I thought about in terms of making grace tangible was the number of times growing up that as I was sort of late high school, for about 3 years, we would visit a nursing home every week. And what I remember is the smell. I don't remember every person, but I remember a lot of faces, but I remember the smell. And do you know, when we're out on mission with God, there's so much about God's grace to people that the smells and the sights and the feelings and the feels, the touch, the hugs that you get. There's just so much that God does in and through us when we're present in the lives of other people that I think we literally make grace tangible. They see it in your smile. They feel it in your hug. They hear it in your words. They smell it in hospitality when you invite them over and you've got, I don't know, some veggie korma cooking or something. That's Indian food, by the way. There's all the sights and the smells and the sounds of making disciples, and that's what we're engaged in. It's a very tangible thing. And then I think it's also that not only do we make grace tangible, I think we make grace accessible to them. When they see you living a life that is following the Lord Jesus Christ, I think for them it becomes plausible. I could do that too. I could see myself doing that. And by virtue of our presence in their lives, I think we make grace accessible to them. In other words, I think we ought to engage in relationship with them. Can I show you one more verse? It's 1 Corinthians 5, 9 and 10. We just did 2 Corinthians 5. Would you look at 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9 and 10? In 1 Corinthians, Paul has written a letter to the church at Corinth, and he says to them about the first letter, I wrote to you in my first letter, which apparently there was a first Corinthians. This is 1 Corinthians, and he's saying, I wrote to you in the other letter. You'll have to wrestle through that. But he says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. And I guess they took that the wrong way. Because he says, well, let me clarify. I didn't at all mean the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy people, or the swindlers, or idolaters, because then you'd have to go out of the world. And what he's saying, I think, is an argument by reverse. He's saying, look, I'm telling you, associate with them. I'm telling you, live with them, talk with them, have them over for dinner, be accused of all the same things Jesus was accused of when he's hanging out with those kinds of people. If we're a church that thinks that we can't hang out with these kinds of people or show them, demonstrate to them the kind of love God has demonstrated to us, we have grossly missed the mark. And Paul tells us from an argument from reverse, though, but I think he's saying, associate with sexually immoral people. Associate with, build relationships with greedy people, swindlers, idolaters. He goes on to say in another place, because some of you were these kinds of people. And maybe he's just being nice. All of us were. And so the call for us to partner together in the good news of Jesus Christ is to see no one beyond the reach of the good news of Jesus Christ. That's a very self-righteous way of looking at things, because what that says then is that you see yourself, perceive yourself to be within reach of the good news, but not that guy or not that girl. The truth is, if the good news of Jesus Christ has the power to save us, it has the power to save anyone. So I'm calling us today to a partnership in the gospel, and I'm asking you to join us in that. Let me pray.